What's up, guys? Nito here, and welcome back to another episode of Noteworthy Interactions. I'm going to do a quick Ziggurat Tier 17 map to show you this new build I've been playing, which is a Warden, currently level 96. And I'll get into the builds after, but you'll see pretty quickly what it is. Basically, it's cast while channeling Rolling Magma using this new runecraft. The projectiles are fired in a random direction and +2 additional projectiles. So basically with Rolling Magma, when the projectile bounces, normally it just bounces in a straight line, but with this runecraft, it's going to bounce each time it chains. It's going to change directions and basically lets it bounce back on top of enemies and hit them multiple times. So it's extremely strong. Previously, you could only get this effect from Nimbus, which is really expensive this league. It's like 200-something divines. At least it was last time I checked. But this runecraft is closer to like 15-ish divines. So still not super cheap, but definitely cheaper than a Nimbus. And so basically we're just playing Cyclone cast while channeling and shooting out lots of balls. I will note that this is a Fizz's Extra and 16% LE pen map, so it is kind of, potentially kind of rippy, but we'll see. See if I can find the boss pretty quick. Show you what the bossing looks like. And I will just point out that, well, I'll do it in a second after this phase, but if you look at Katarina, she's going to have a basically 100% shock on her. And that is because we are using the Oath of Spring? Or, yeah, Oath of Spring, I think it's called. Warden Ascendancy. And it basically lets us stack 2% shocks instead of one big shock, and it can stack all the way up to 100%. And because we're hitting so many times with our rolling magma, it's going to stack up lots of shock stacks. And I'll explain better after the fight's over. Alright, there you go. Okay, so that's the build. As you can see, pretty decent damage, pretty tanky, lots of fun, lots of magma balls. So yeah, let's get into it. Like I said, the idea was to build around this projectiles are fired in a random direction modifier. And we crafted this maul with spell damage from an essence. It's actually pretty easy to craft this weapon. You just basically spam the essence for spell damage until you get 2 open prefixes and at least 1 open suffix. And then what you do, you can basically do prefixes, or yeah, prefixes cannot be changed. Then you scour suffixes to get rid of all the suffixes. Then you do cannot roll attack modifiers, and then you slam it, and you're basically guaranteed to get the +1 socketed gems on there. And actually, sorry, you don't scour the suffixes first. You craft the cannot roll attack modifiers so that the suffixes are full. Then you slam it to get the +1 socketed gems on there, because it's the only option that you will always get +1 to socketed gems, because there are no other prefixes that don't have the attack modifier. So it's really easy to get the prefixes. And then you do prefixes can't be changed, scour suffixes, and then multi-mod. It's pretty much that simple. And you'll notice it's a +3 to support gems. So we are actually using Empower and Enhance. And the reason we do that, so obviously Empower is just a bunch of extra gem levels. So our Rolling Magma is level 28 now. And the reason Enhance is so good for this build is Rolling Magma gets extra chains from quality. So this is also basically giving us +4 chains. It's basically a better awakened chain because it's more chains and it's also no less damage downside that you would normally get from the chain support. And it's also affecting Cyclone. So Cyclone's getting 35% more movement speed from quality, which actually completely negates and actually it completely negates the 30% less move speed downside. And we are actually faster while cycloning. So it feels really good and really just like nice to zoom around with. And then we're also using Awaken Fire Pen and Awaken Cast while channeling. And one thing to note about Awaken Cast while channeling, this is how we're getting basically stun immunity because we ignore stuns while cycloning, which is super important for this build because we don't have any other source of stun immunity. But so that's like the main damage setup. And obviously we are also using a synthesized base that has the spells have an 18% chance to deal double damage modifier on there. I was also really lucky and found a base that has like just a bunch of flat fire damage to spells on it in addition, which is just nice extra damage, but that's pretty cool. So yeah, to go over some of the other mechanics in the build. Like I said during the boss fight, we're using Oath of Spring, which makes the maximum effect of our shock 2% instead of 50%. But you can stack shocks up to 50 times. So you can have 100 total shocks, basically. And, sorry, not 100 separate shocks. 50 shocks of 2% each for 100% shock effect, essentially. We're also using Avatar of the Wilds to get Unbound, which is this skill right here. It basically just gives you 80% more elemental damage, and you always inflict freeze, shock, and ignite while unbound, but you have to stack it up to 100 stacks. You basically have to apply. See how I have 91 right now? You have to apply 100 ailments, and you can only apply like 5, I believe, per second for each ailment. So for this build, we're doing shocks. And I should mention the way that we're getting shock is from Yoke of Suffering, which says your elemental damage can shock. So this is how we're shocking with our fire damage, right? So we're not doing added lightning or anything like that. We're doing basically pure fire damage. We do have a little bit of added cold, which I'll explain in a second. But yeah, so we're doing shocks. We're doing ignites because it's fire damage. So we're getting ignites from... We have ignite chance from like our curse. So I have a curse on ring with curse on hit ring with flammability, and then that little bit of cold damage on there, which again is coming from this ring, just that crafted flat cold damage. That's also going to be applying chill because we are taking the cold mastery that makes chills from your hits always reduce action speed by at least 10%, and you also get 40% chill effect from this wheel, and then also enemies take 1% increased damage for each second they've been chilled. So you get just 14% base chill. Hold on, sorry, I gotta disable my live search that's pinging in the background. Okay, yeah, so you get 14% chill just from this, even if you only are doing 1 cold damage. You don't need to do a big hit or anything like that. And you get some extra increased damage taken for enemies as well. So that's really good, and it also just helps to stack up Avatar of the Wilds like super quickly. So I'd say on average this is up like maybe every 10 seconds or so, or, you know, around that. It kind of depends how many enemies you're hitting at once, but it's got very high uptime on this build just because we're hitting obviously so many times a second. And obviously that also has synergy with Yoke of Suffering, which says enemies take 9% increased damage for each type of ailment you have inflicted on them. And that rolls up to 10%. Which is actually what that search was, pinging was for a better amulet with a 10% roll. But yeah, so we are doing shocks, ignites, chills. Then on our gloves, we have attacks have a chance to cause bleeding. So our Cyclone is applying bleed. And then over here, we have the Curse Mastery that's giving us poison chance as well. So that is 5 different ailments. Freeze doesn't, like, technically we have a chance to freeze, but we do so little cold damage that we are almost never freezing anything. But yeah, you're getting ignite, shock, poison, chill, and bleed on pretty much everything. And that's basically 50% increased damage taken. So you have 100% increased damage taken from Oath of Spring. You have 50% increased damage taken from Yoke of Suffering. Then we also apply Unnerve from our gloves, which is another 10% increased damage taken. And yeah, and then you have the 10% from Glacial Cage as well. So you have like 170% increased damage taken for enemies. Which obviously that's all additive, so it is like a little bit of diminishing returns, but it's still really, really strong. And then plus the 80% more damage from Avatar of the Wilds. And as far as damage-wise, like, we're also taking the reduced proj speed and less proj speed mastery. And that's basically just because you want the balls to all be landing near each other and not bouncing too far, because they're going to overlap more the slower the projectile speed is, basically. The other, like, I did also test the projectiles deal 20% increased damage with hits and ailments for each time they've chained. I tested that. It's pretty good. It is quite good, but I think the less proj speed is slightly better. I'm not 100% sure, but I think I like the less proj speed better. The other thing to note is that if the balls bounce into a wall, they stop chaining. So if they hit an obstacle, they're going to stop their chains, even if they still have chains left. And because of that, I think that the less proj speed is more important, because it prevents the balls from going too far away from you and just like all kind of like fizzling out on the walls. So this build is a little bit worse in like tight corridors, like, you know, like Toxic Sewers is like a bad map for this build, but it's really good for open areas. So like something like Dunes, or I've been running like Jungle Valley, and like Mesa is pretty good, although Mesa also has some tight areas sometimes, but it's still pretty good. And the other thing we do for our damage, so up here we take the shock chance, and static blows gives us increased damage if you've shocked an enemy recently, gives us increased duration of lightning ailments, and then increased effect of lightning ailments. So that just helps apply, you know, the 2% shock, because you do still have to reach kind of a minimum shock value to apply the 2%. Also, it's giving 50% effective lightning ailments, which is applying to the sapped ground from our boots. And actually, I forgot about this one. We actually have 6 ailments for Yoke of Suffering, because we're applying sapped ground from our boots. And sapped just makes the enemy deal less damage. So it's a 6% base less damage, but with this it goes up to 9%. And that's going to be important for our defenses, and I'll explain that in a second. But the other thing that's really important is we use Defiled Forces, which says refresh the duration of ignite, chill, and shock on enemies you curse. And basically each of the 50 shock stacks that we apply from our Ascendancy has a separate duration. And so, like, just applying a new shock is not going to refresh the duration of all the other shocks by default. So it's easy for them to fall off if you're not hitting super quickly all the time, which for the most part we are, but it's still really hard to reach that maximum 100% effect without Defiled Forces here, because we are essentially, every time we hit the enemy, we are cursing on hit with flammability, and that is just going to refresh the duration of all shocks on the enemy, and basically, lets you just ramp up the shock effect without ever worrying about it falling off. So enemies are basically always going to have the full effect after like 2 or 3 seconds. We also take the shocks you inflict spread to other enemies within 1 meter mastery from the lightning cluster. And that is just going to help like wall clearing when there's, 10 enemies in a pack. You hit them once, you're gonna basically apply 10 stacks immediately, right? Because like every enemy is going to get shocked. And then they're all going to, spread the shock to every other enemy. So yeah, it's just a way to help stack up shocks quicker in packs. And then the other really, really good thing for this build is follow through. And this comes on the medium cluster duel for projectile damage, and basically deals 15% increased damage with hits and ailments for each remaining chain. And as you can see, projectiles chain 10 times. So you can actually get that up to 11 if you get a 21... So I have a 2120 quality gem. If you get a 2123 quality gem from double corrupting it in a temple, you can actually get 1 extra chain. Because Enhance is giving plus 48 to quality. If that goes up to plus 50, then yeah, you get 1 extra chain from quality. So I haven't gotten it yet. I've gotten unlucky with the Temple Corrupts, but hopefully at some point we get that extra chain. And so basically, follow through is just giving 150% increased damage for 1 node. And obviously that kind of falls off a little bit as the projectiles bounce around, but it's still like extremely powerful for 1 node. And then on the other side, we have Eye to Eye, which is 60% increased damage, which again, very strong, right? Because enemies are pretty much always nearby. And then we have the same thing over here. We have another follow through. This is a Megalomaniac. So we have a second follow through. We have Enduring Focus, which is how we generate endurance charges, because you just gain charges while channeling. And then Prismatic Carapace for some extra armor and maxillary res. And then on our large cluster, it's just it's an 8 passive. It doesn't really matter too much what you have on here, although you do need the Doryani's Lesson to get some LE Leech. That's where this is like our only source of LE or of Leech for our spells. And then we're also just destroying enemies on hit, so we don't have to deal with on-death effects and stuff like that. And then over here, we're kind of grabbing the fire damage AoE stuff, just because AoE does help with additional overlaps for rolling magma. You can also take this. This is more AoE right here. I ended up swapping over to this one because I really need the Fire Mastery to regenerate life, because one of the biggest issues and one of the hardest things to solve with this build was the mana cost. So we're basically triggering slightly more than 3 times a second rolling magma, and it's 57 mana per trigger on top of the Cyclone mana cost, and that's pretty hard to sustain. So I ended up using Eldritch Battery, but I only really have 1 energy shield item. Like only really have space for 1 on my build, and that's the gloves. In theory, you could get like a little bit higher if this had better prefixes. I've been trying to craft one, but haven't gotten lucky yet. But yeah, if it has better prefixes, you can get a little bit higher energy shield. But even so, it's not quite enough just to sustain off of energy shield recharge. So we actually had to go Zealot's Oath to make life regen apply to our energy shield, and then regenerate 1 life per second for each uncapped fire res. Is just going to give us a bunch of flat life regen, which then gets converted to ES regen, and that's how we sustain our mana cost. But yeah, it took a while to like solve that. For a while, I was using Soul Thief with the mastery that gives every 4 seconds regenerate energy shield equal to 1% of evasion rating. That was pretty good, but it ended up being basically just overall worse. Like, it was more points to spend. I was also using 1 point here for Spell Leech as energy shield. But yeah, it ended up just being like more points and just kind of worse at sustaining. So I swapped to Zealous Oath, and we run a low level Vitality as well, which is actually reserving our life. So that's why we have 137 life reserved. It's just giving us just enough energy shield regen we have like 150-ish. It's just enough to sustain. And the other thing of like the reason I reserved life instead of mana, I technically could reserve it on mana, but I wanted to use, actually, it's not that one, it's this one. The +1 to max res if you've reserved life and mana. And as you can see, the other auras we're reserving on our mana pool. Our whole mana pool is reserved. And we're running Grace, we're running Purity of Fire, and Determination. And so basically, the defensive side of this build is really interesting. And I think Warden has a lot to offer defensively that I don't think people have really explored yet. And it all starts with Barkskin. So Barkskin is Warden specific. You only get it from this node here, and it's a 10% reservation effect. And it basically every second you gain Bark if you haven't been hit recently, up to a maximum of 10, and each Bark gives -30 physical damage taken from attacks per Bark, and then 2% more chance to evade per Bark below the maximum. So if you're getting hit a lot, you're going to get more chance to evade. So that's a more multiplier to your evasion, which is really, really powerful. And we combine that with Wind Dancer, which is also a more evasion chance multiplier. And we use Grace and some evasion on our body armor. And I also have this Watcher's Eye, which gives flat evade chance while affected by Grace. So we basically have 95% evasion chance most of the time. So like currently you can see I'm only at 19k evasion, but once we get hit like once, that just pops up, right? Because of Barkskin and Wind Dancer. So we have really good avoidance. And then on top of that, we're running Determination. So we have like 16k armor. And obviously this is without flasks and stuff. So I'm running Basalt and a Stibnite with, increased armor, increased evasion on there. So that's going to pop our evasion and armor up much higher. But yeah, so Barkskin, the flat physical damage reduction is stronger than people realize. So at 10 stacks, it's -300 physical damage. And there's something important you have to understand about basically how damage is taken and the order that things are calculated in. So flat minus damage is calculated in the same, basically before reduced damage taken is calculated. So the order basically goes like additional physical damage reduction, which is armor, which is endurance charges, which is things like on the chest, like the suffix additional physical damage reduction, right? That all gets added together. So let's say your armor is giving you 50% additional physical damage reduction, and then you have 5 endurance charges. I only have 3 on this build. Well, okay, we'll say 3 endurance charges, which is another 12, right? Each one gives 4. And then the body armor is another 8, right? So that would be like 70% reduction. And then normally physical damage reduction can only stack up to 90%. So it's capped at 90%. But the flat minus physical damage taken from Barkskin can then bring your physical damage taken to 0. Like, it's basically the only way without having like 100% less damage taken to actually reduce hits to 0, right? You need that flat damage taken after the damage reduction is applied. And you'll notice I'm using the Persistence Anoint on Yoke of Suffering, which is giving me -10 physical damage taken from hits, and then another -1 per level. So I'm level 96, so that's -106 physical damage taken. And that's just going to stack with Barkskin. So all of our hits, basically, if any hit deals less than 400 physical damage, it's reduced to 0. And that's why we stack a bunch of armor, and that's why we stack well, we don't really stack, but we have endurance charges. We have physical damage reduction from the chest. We also use the Pantheon, which gives some extra physical damage reduction, as well as reduced elemental damage taken, stuff like that. It's important to note, though, that in the order of operations, additional physical damage reduction comes first, then flat damage, reduced damage taken comes, and then percent reduced damage taken comes. So there's a difference between additional physical damage reduction and reduced damage taken. So reduced damage taken is not going to reduce it basically it is not going to reduce you to 0 on its own, right? Like the physical damage, the flat reduced damage taken comes first, and then the multiplicative, or the then the multiplicative effect happens afterwards, basically. And then less damage taken happens. So stuff like Fortify, for example, would be a less damage taken multiplier. So that happens like last, and then actually the final step is suppression. So suppression 50%. That happens all the way at the very end. So you want to essentially, to take advantage of Barkskin reducing damage taken to 0, you want to basically stack the first part, which is additional physical damage reduction, right? So that's armor, endurance charges, and other sources of additional physical damage reduction. The other thing you can do is you can make the enemy deal less damage, because dealing less damage is actually comes before the additional physical damage reduction, because it's applying to the enemy itself, not to you, right? And so that's why we use Sapped, because it makes the enemy deal less damage. We are also using Pyroshock Clasp, which says enemies ignited by you have 15% of physical damage they deal converted to fire, and enemies shocked by you have 15% phys damage converted to lightning. Since we're igniting and shocking pretty much the entire screen all the time, basically every enemy is doing 30% phys as elemental. And that conversion step happens before we actually take the damage, right? It's actually converting the enemy's damage as opposed to the damage that we take. Also on our chest, we have 11% phys damage from hits taken as fire. Again, that conversion happens before the additional physical damage reduction step. So it's another way to further reduce the size of the hit, which then increases the effectiveness of armor, because armor is based on the size of the hit. Like armor's physical damage reduction is based on the size of the hit, right? So you want to take as much damage as elemental first as possible, and then apply a lot of armor, and then, try to max out your physical damage reduction to 90%, and then you have the minus flat damage come in and take that last 10% down to 0, right? And that's how you get really tanky. You'll also notice on my Watcher's Eye, I have the cold and lightning taken as fire while affected by Purity of Fire. So basically every elemental hit is going to do a little bit of fire damage. And the reason that's really strong is because of Lesson of the Seasons. So Lesson of the Seasons gives minus 15 fire, cold, and lightning damage taken from spell hits per bark. Basically, if you split the damage types, that minus 15 is applying multiple times. So for each damage type, you're getting minus 15. So instead of just taking minus 150 at max bark, if you're taking 2 damage types, you're taking minus 300. If you're taking all 3 damage types, you're taking minus 450 elemental damage. And then on top of that, we're using the Formless Flame, which has minus 173 fire damage taken from hits. That goes up to minus 200. And it also scales our armor off of overcapped fire res. So like, this is how we get a bunch of armor for the physical side, and it's also how we reduce the fire damage from the elemental side. And that is working with this Watcher's Eye for all elemental damage, not just fire. And then also we have this ring, which is a synthesized ring, that again has minus fire damage taken from hits and some minus lightning damage taken from hits. So all of that just adds together, and it basically is really good at negating like smaller hits. So it almost feels like you're blocking the hit because you're essentially taking the hit but not taking damage. But obviously I don't have any block chance on this build. I'm not using a shield, and I have 0 investment into block, right? But it still kind of feels that way because of this whole setup. And it's just turned out to be really strong. As you saw on this map, like this was a 108% Fizz's extra fire, 16% LE pen map. So like, you know, for a lot of builds that would be pretty deadly, right? But because we have this damage reduction set up, it's pretty good. And then on top of that, we have that like high avoidance from the Wind Dancer Barkskin setup. And the other part of Lesson of the Seasons is that it says prevent plus 2% of spell damage per bark below maximum. So at 0 bark, you're getting plus 20% on top of the base 50% suppression, right? And then we also use the Mastery, that's another plus 3, and then Innervate is another plus 3. So with max, or with the 0 bark, we're at 76% damage reduction from spells, right? Which is huge, right? It's basically an extra more than 50% less spell damage taken on top of the regular suppression, which is already, obviously, everybody knows how strong suppression is, right? So it's an extra 50% on top. So it's super strong. And you can also use the... In this build, I couldn't fit it in, but if you can overcap your suppression, you can use the minus 2% chance to suppress spell damage per hit recently, plus 1% suppressed spell damage per hit suppressed recently. Like, you can use that and stack it up even further, all the way up to 100% reduced, or suppressed damage, basically. So you just take 0 damage from spells. Obviously, you would need enough suppression chance. You'd have to be overcapped enough on suppression in order to take advantage of that. Which means you know, every hit, every time you get hit by a spell, you need an extra 2% suppression in order to not take damage. And I wanted to do it for this build, but I ended up needing my suppression because I'm using Ancestral Vision. That's how I'm getting ailment immunity. So we are fully immune to ailments with Ancestral Vision because we have slightly overcapped spell suppression. I think it's like 108 or 110 or something. And then we have this Thick Skin is giving us 20% chance to avoid elemental ailments. Our boots are giving us 26%. And with that together, we have full avoidance. So you can see, yeah, 100% avoidance. And yeah, so like with max bark, I have max bark right now because I haven't been hit recently. We're sitting at 56, but that will jump all the way up to 76 when we've taken a bunch of hits recently, right? So it's really, really strong defensively. And I think people haven't really fully explored this Lesson of the Seasons and Mother's Teaching, like, or Barkskin setup yet. But I think it's really, really strong. And there's even some other things you can do where, like, you go like Tempered by War or something to get even more elemental conversion, and you can go full LE to fire conversion if you wanted to, just to really take advantage of the minus fire from these two, on top of the Lesson of the Seasons if you wanted to. Another thing you can do is you can use the Flawed Refuge Shield, which is going to convert 40% of elemental damage taken to physical damage, which then lets your Barkskin apply to elemental damage, basically. Like the base Barkskin, the minus 300 physical damage taken, and also the Persistence, they're both going to essentially apply to elemental damage taken if you use that shield. And I tested it out, and it seems really strong. But of course, then you also need to have good physical mitigation in order to mitigate the rest of the physical side after the conversion, right? But yeah, this setup has been very, very nice on this build. And I mean, it did take a while to like get up and running. So, you know, I definitely died a lot, like, while leveling this build. I actually leveled it as a completely different build and then respect after I kind of, like, figured out some of these mechanics. Which is why my character name makes no sense, because I'm not even using... The original build was going to be using the Oath of Winter and the Oath of Spring, so, like, it was going to be using these two, but then, yeah, I completely changed. So, anyways, that is basically what we're doing in terms of our defenses. You know, our boots are just some suppress, sapped ground, avoid ailments, move speed. The other thing to note is that this build has a pretty high strength requirement because of the Conquest Lamellar needing 173 and the Maul needing 164. So it is pretty hard to get enough strength. So we do need some big strength rolls on gear. So we have it on boots, and then we have it on our ring. And like, we're obviously in the int part of the tree and the dex part of the tree, so we're really not getting very much from the tree itself. So it is a little hard to solve some of the attribute requirements for the build. So yeah, like, you do need, like, good gear to actually make it work with the Conquest Lamellar if you want to use this. You could go, you know, you could use a worse base and get less armor and less evasion, but I really wanted to make this one work. And oh yeah, this also has strength on it as well. So yeah, it's tight. It's tight on a lot of the suffixes, but you can make it work. And let's see, what else are we doing? Oh yeah, we in our chest we have a cast and damage taken level 1 with ball lightning. And again, because we have all of the extra projectiles, and projectiles are fired in random directions, ball lightning is also going to fire out in all directions, basically, when that cast and damage taken triggers. And it's going to be applying combustion to everything, so it's going to be igniting stuff, and then everything's going to get -10 to fire res. And then, you know, we get the fire damage from the ring and also from the fire damage to spells on our maul as well, so that's how we're making ball lightning ignite. It's also doing cull and applying blind to everything. And then, yeah, we just have GMP, so there's more balls that shoot out in every direction. So that's kind of a nice little utility cast and damage taken setup that we've been using. It's pretty good. And I am running Vitality again on life, Flame Dash, and then we're automating Molten Shell and more duration. The other thing I forgot to talk about, Defiance Banner. So this build is not a melee build, really. It is, I mean, Cyclone is melee, but we're not actually really killing much with melee. So Defiance Banner is not very good because we're not really gaining Valor very frequently. But if you do play a melee Warden build, Defiance Banner is insane because it gives you -12, again, flat minus damage taken, of each damage type. So if you're splitting damage types, it's applying multiple times, right? And it lets you overcap your spell suppress easily because it also grants spell suppression. So you can utilize that mastery that reduces your suppression but increases the amount suppressed, right? You can utilize that with Defiance Banner if you have a reliable way to gain Valor. And it gets 10% more aura effect per Valor consumed. And you can stack up to, like, if you come down here, you can get, like, +30, you can get, like, +50 something. So I think you can get over 100 Valor. And so at max effect, you can get, like, -200-ish to damage taken from each type. And it also scales off of, like, aura effect. So, like, there's an aura, banner aura rallying icon. Yeah, this wheel gives banner aura effect, too. So, for a melee Warden, I would highly consider using Defiance Banner as a defensive mechanic if you're going to do some of this, like, Barkskin stacking damage splitting stuff, because this is, like, super good. Yeah, for this build, I'm not really actually using it. I am technically automating it so that when Cyclone randomly kills, like, one enemy, I'll get, like, 1 Valor, and then it'll immediately place the banner down. on that note, actually, I was testing some of the mechanics around that. I think there's a cool thing you can do with any banner and automation. If you just automate it so that it gets placed immediately as soon as you gain Valor, what you can do is you can then come over here, you can take Awe and Terror, which causes enemies killed near your banner to have 20% chance to explode. So you like quickly drop the banner, blow everything up, and then automatically gets picked up when you leave the area, and then automatically gets dropped again the next time you kill an enemy, right? So it's kind of like a way to automate having Explodey in a build, as long as you're gaining Valor occasionally. You could even use, like, you can also do Bannerman to, like, make the buff linger on you, so, like, you don't actually have to stop. You can, like, keep going outside the circle. I'm not 100% sure if that still causes the explosion to happen. That needs some testing, but and then the Banner Mastery that makes you gain Warcry, or gain Valor when you Warcry. You can do that as a way to just consistently gain Valor and then drop your banner. So yeah, I couldn't fit it in this build, but it was something I was messing around with that was kind of cool. And then yeah, I mean, the other stuff is just we got some tattoos like blind chance on hit, just a bunch of cold res, and then like I tattooed some increased max ES just because I was having issues like sustaining and I needed a larger energy shield pool to get extra recharge. We have a tiny % chance to hinder on hit, and because we're hitting so frequently, like, it's pretty much hindering everything just from one tattoo. And then just a little more res there. So I believe that's pretty much the whole build. Oh yeah, I forgot that this Watcher's Eye also has additional physical damage reduction while affected by Determination. So yeah, that's another source of phys damage reduction you can get. You can get it from this Pantheon, you can get it from this Pantheon, get it from this one, you can get it from this one. So there's a bunch of additional physical damage reduction on the Pantheon that I think people kind of forgot existed. So it's worth considering that. This is just, yeah, we don't have any life mods on our chest, so we just got extra max life there. We're at 4k life. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the build. It's honestly one of my favorite builds ever. It's really fun. It's really tanky. It does really solid damage. So, highly recommend it. Yeah, anyways, thank you for watching. You know, like and subscribe, whatever, if you like the video. And also shout out to our Discord, the Noteworthy Interactions Discord. I will leave a link down below in the description. And it's a great place to just come and discuss build ideas and stuff like that. Do some theory crafting. So if you're interested, check it out. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.